Hello, everybody. Welcome to the launch for Whitemud Walking by Matthew James Weigel. This is an incredible, beautiful, important book of poetry. If you can see the silver river there, oh, just majestic. This is a visually stunning book of poetry. You can't even totally get a taste here, but I'll just give you a little teaser if you can. Matthew is going to do a reading later, but I really want to encourage you all to get a copy of this yourself so you can see the full product, the full Monty of what's going on in this amazing book. Matthew is going to do a brief reading, and he's going to be joined by his editor on this book, Jordan Abel, the great poet as well. Jordan's popping up. Before we get going, I just want to give a quick land acknowledgement. We are coming, Coach House is coming to you from Toronto tonight. So we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And here is Jordan Abel, friend of Coach House, member of the Coach House Poetry Board. Jordan is a queer Nisga'a writer from Vancouver. He's the author of A Place of Scraps, winner of the Dorothy Livesey Poetry Prize, Uninhabited and Injun, winner of the Griffin Poetry Prize. Abel's latest book is Nishka by McClellan and Stewart. It's a deeply personal and autobiographical book that attempts to address the complications of contemporary Indigenous existence and the often invisible intergenerational impact of residential schools. Everybody, please welcome Jordan Abel.
Hey, thanks for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here, and especially thank you for Matthew for being here. This is a super cool moment. This is a super cool moment for this book and for Matthew and for me too, as the editor of this project, and also just admirer of visual poetics and Indigenous poetics. So I just wanted to, wanted to say that at the outset, and I will introduce Matthew, and then hey, there's Matthew. And then Matthew will do a reading, and then we'll have a conversation. And I'm really looking forward to this. I think it's going to be awesome. Matthew, I didn't ask you for an updated bio because I figured that I could read the bio that's in the book. And if that's already outdated at the moment of the book launch, then that is a thing that we should talk about. I feel like, you're always doing so many cool things, and I could fully see how there might be stuff missing already from this, but I'll give it a try. So this is Matthew. Matthew James Weigel is an Edmonton born and based Dene and Métis poet and artist. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Biological Sciences and a Master of Arts in English from the University of Alberta, where he is currently pursuing a PhD in English. Queer, disabled, former zookeeper and feeder of sharks, sponge aquarist. Also the designer for Moon Jellyhouse Press. His words and art have been published by people like Arc Poetry Magazine, Book Hug, The Polyglots, and the Mamawi Project. His art can be found in some public places in Edmonton. Some of that art that's in the public places in Edmonton is also in this book, I think, or crosses over. Maybe. He has been a National Magazine Award finalist, shortlisted for the Nelson Ball Prize and the winner of the Cecile E. McTaggart Award. His chapbook collection, It Was Treaty / It Was Me, won the 2020 Vallum Chapbook Award and the 2021 BP Nickel Chapbook Award. And some of that stuff is also in this book. And Whitemud Walking is his first full-length collection of poetry. So welcome, Matthew. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I know the bios are always like really strange when there's like a small group. It feels weird to have your bio read out to folks, but it's yeah, the outdated part is entertaining. It's always and when you're an active artist doing stuff, and then it's always great when you can add to your bio because that means that you've done something new.
Totally.
Yeah.
You're doing so many things.
But yeah, the art question, I guess, yeah, that's there's some new stuff in the works as well. But also some of that work did kind of translate. I draw a lot of buffalo and birds and stuff, so they kind of all become one large project. Nisha always says I only really write one poem, which I think is 100% true. So I really only draw one thing too. So yeah.
Totally. I think, that's the way of the artist. You do the one thing, and then it turns into this beautiful book. Cool. Did you did you want to read the one thing?
I can read some of the one thing. Yeah, I can do that.
Cool. Okay.
I know we have a schedule, but I'm not sure how much we have to like adhere to.
Oh yeah, I think we can kind of do what we want.
Okay.
Is my understanding. Seeing as seeing as how you're the one in the driver's seat. Whatever makes sense for you.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I can read a couple poems.
Sure.
It was I just came back from Saskatoon where I did my first live show out of town, which was really exciting. And I learned that a lot of my poems are incredibly sad. And so in the future, I'll try to write some less sad poems. But these are the ones I have now. So these are the ones that I will read today.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I'll get started. I also I realize that I tell a lot of stories in and around the poems, which everyone knows, of course, explaining poetry makes it a lot better. But that being said, I don't always have the space to tell all of the stories that I would like to tell. And so we'll try not to meander too much tonight. This is called Inside the Pop-Up Box, and it's about a trip to Libraries and Archives Canada, the Preservation Center, which is a really fancy way of titling what is a really strange looking building. I'm in the library that Canada keeps my kin in. And I brought all of the other libraries that I've ever been in with me. There's my mom's library, where as a child, I saw a pop-up dinosaur and rows of shelving and drawers I thought must hold so many fossils. And my dad's library of tapes in the car. And my favorite songs are the ones that tell a story, and we drive all day. And my dad tells stories. And I thought, every story must be a layer in the earth of stories. And I thought, it's the stories in front of you that you remember the best. And so this time I'm in a library, and it's full of glass to let the sun in. But all the books are in metal boxes, in stacks, in rows of other metal boxes, all inside this concrete box. And the glass walls let the sun in, and it's warm in there. And I am warm, holding my coat and my sweater and my bag and all of the other things that are not my name, that I write on a clipboard. And it is not lost on me that I'm here to see my great-great-grandfather's signature, and that I must offer mine to the library first. You see, in this library, they hold the layers of the thing called Canada, and they keep it in a vault, and behind it is another vault, and across it is another row of vaults, and I can see the vaults, but no, I cannot see the vaults. Beyond us is the new building, the building they say will be staffed by robots, arms of a safe temperature, reminding us that to touch a document is to take a piece of it with you and to leave a piece of you behind. And it is this exchange that we must climate control in a de-reciprocal programming. And so when only the dead and programmed can see my kin, no one will see my kin. See me, my layers, a proclamation by the king with a line down its center. And this layer is the treaty. This layer is the treaty. This layer is the treaty that cuts through the center of me. Whereas, in a line of red ink beneath, whereas in a red ink, Her Majesty, whereas I am a measure of a constitution, my kin and marked by hand, tooled in a border of fading gold foil, and with a spine that is no longer structural, but splayed propelle cutem on a table and numbered. Thank you. I learned people like to know what page you're on so they can like read along when you're doing a reading, which was interesting because usually when I in like spoken word circles, you know, you're not surrounded by people who are holding your book. So at the book launch, when people were holding my book, which was also strange, it was strange for that reason as well, because I did not realize that people liked reading along. So if you would like to read along, I'm going to jump around, so this might be extremely difficult, but this is on page 51, and it's called 1876 Treaty Number 6. I wake up at 6 a.m. to a weight on my chest, and I massage it until it says the word treaty. 1876, and my uncle is at Peonan. He signs the treaty with a leftward slant. It is August, and the aspens bend in the wind. Dreamt I was in a library again, walking down the stairs into the basement, walking down the stairs into the earth. I see the treaty parchment on a wooden table. And it comes as no surprise that it is the land herself that holds this knowledge. I'm going to skip to 125 now, and you can see another signature. This is the signature of my great-great-grandfather, J.A.R. James Allen Rowan Falsley, as it appears on the Treaty 11 manuscript codex book. 1921, Treaty Number 11. My lungs are full of spruce trees, but otherwise I am empty. I am here to witness. 1921, and grandfather working for the company in Fort Providence. It is June, and that far north, the sun would not set on the British Empire. He signs the treaty with heavy ink, with his own pen. Dreamt I was a library again. It is an all or nothing calling. I have language for it. I have bones. But otherwise am formless before the 7 a.m. alarm, held loose on birdsong, briefly, between the low notes on their way to the water. I am bounded by the geese and punctuated by the dwindling of the caribou. 2020 witness continued. I dreamt I was a river again, a thread of a glacier unwinding itself in slow motion, just slow enough to dip hands in and drink. I think I'll do a couple more. And I think one of the things that's interesting that maybe we'll talk about a bit about is just like how long this project, I mean, writing a book takes a long time. Getting a book out the door takes a long time. This particular book was like literally 3 years, pretty much exactly to the day of a project. And it, not to this day, but to the day that we hit print and the book became a book. And so part of that process was, you know, returning to things that were written earlier in that 3-year period. And so that really brought home in that sort of returning that I am indeed just writing one poem, and that there's all of these little moments and spots that get circled back to, whether I realized it later on or not. And this is on page 148 for those following along at home. This is about the geoscience garden outside the science building at the University of Alberta, which is a favorite subject of mine, the university. And they call it a geoscience garden, but really it's just a bunch of rocks in like a small grassy area next to a parking lot. And it's really awesome. You can learn a lot and you can see a lot of cool stuff, but it's also kind of messed up for lots of reasons. One of which is that there's a footnote on this that many of the informants said water and mountains had not been mentioned at the treaty negotiation. So the mountains are not a thing that were included in treaty. And if you are so nerdily inclined to look at the exact borders of the treaty as delineated in the document, it makes it very clear that there's a lot of language that's like about or near or along, rather than more language that's very specific in what is included, and the mountains are not. And so this quotation from the plaque outside the geoscience garden: the geoscience garden contains types of rock that are important to Canada's landscape and people. They are arranged so as to tell the story of the Earth's crust in Canada. The rocks are placed so that students of earth science can learn to make field observations and interpret Earth history. And so you could think of this as glaciers, as erratic stones of tremendous stature, immovable, set carefully as points amid the prairie, as stories, as lessons, as data, as a university more immovable than stone, setting carefully with heavy equipment as plaques to tell which corporation's courtesy brought the mountains to the campus. You could think of this as mountains. You could think of the present shape of the landscape as a story of how things are and will be again, as a lesson, as a glacier melting, as a Saskatchewan drainage slowly setting the silt of mountains. You could think of this as Edmonton, as progression, as the drink of meltwater, as the flooding in years of infrequent intensity. You could think of this as a modulation of the mud, as where the river flows and bends. You could think of this as all of the water at once, as moving, as ice contorting under its own weight and fluid. And I will pause to take a drink, timed with the airplane flying overhead, which you may be able to hear. I can certainly hear it. All right, I'll do one more. But this particular poem is not an ode to the day I fell off my bike and skinned my knee in the gravel alley behind my cousin's garage, a day that the land took a piece of me. And I had learned to ride a bike so late that I did not have the same confidence and momentum that I had had in gravity. And when you're a child, you hold yourself in an inward way when you cry, in a way that you can no longer hold yourself, in the way that the land holds you, in an all limbs and all joints way. My blood looked so red, being stained in dots through what was left of skin and dust and gravel stuck to the knee. It is the land that was stuck to me while I was extruded. And on that day, I gave something to the land and I resented giving it up. This is not an ode to that day or to the day that I was bullied and thrown in a lake because I was too small and too fat and too much. A day and many other days I felt so small and not enough. So although this is an ode to a day in the valley, when I gave to the creek that gave me, this is not about tobacco or a lesson from a snake that growth sometimes means you leave a part of yourself behind. But for that bright day, in a lush, overwhelming of green in a mosquito summer, where you were not bit as long as you kept moving, with porcupines and a path past depressions in the grass where deer had been sleeping, and flowers and driftwood with tiny spiders, and pools with even smaller fish, and with water that cut so long into the earth, it made a space for all of us. Thank you so much. I think that was about 10-ish minutes. I don't know.
Totally. Yeah, it was exactly 10 minutes.
Nailed it.
I kind of got lost. I got lost in the poetry and I was not looking at the clock. That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Matthew. I honestly have so many questions for you, and I think people here too may have questions, and I just want to throw it out there that you can feel free to drop them in the chat, I guess, and I'll read them out and we can talk about them. I wonder, I mean, I wonder if maybe the most pressing question that I have, is just about reading, and just about, what parts of this text you can read and what parts of this text maybe you can't read. And maybe just about the nature of text too. I was, in so many of your poems, and in so many different places, you address, what or you gesture towards, where text is or where text isn't, or where treaty is and where treaty isn't, and what contains these things, whether it be the earth or the library or the archive or the body, and I guess like the text that really, and you may disagree with this, as the author, and totally feel free to, but the text that I see is one of the main center points in the book, begins on page, kind of begins on page 62, I guess, and with a bit of a framing that happens there, and then part of that text, I guess, starts on page 65 and proceeds forward for like a number of pages, and to me this is one of the most interesting pieces I've ever encountered as a reader, and one that I find is enormously generative and compelling. And for those of you who don't have the book, how would you describe this, Matthew? Or how do you think through? Have you ever attempted to read this part of the text, or how do you talk about this part of the text? When people talk about Whitemud Walking, when you have those conversations. I'm sorry, that's a bunch of questions, but
no, they're all like the important questions. So I'm grateful for them because they're all incredibly complex questions in the question and in the answer. The extremely short answer to the question about how I talk about this section is that it's the section that people, when they're flipping through the book, they say, oh, is it supposed to be like this? Is this, which I think is an incredible like centering for me, like both as someone who does conceptual work, but also like, I don't know if it's supposed to be like this, you know, like I really don't. I think it's a complicated question and a complicated answer, but I don't know how to read it. I think that you can't, but I also think that it's one of those moments where I'm sort of asking myself and whoever's holding the book to think about the boundaries of the text and the boundaries of yourself and the treaty. And that's a kind of theme that gets carried throughout the book to a certain extent, is who gets to tell what stories and keep what stories, and what does keeping these things mean. But for those who don't have the book, it is a sort of, it's a section where there's the bleed of the text carries on past the edges of the book. And so the original text is the Treaties of Canada, which is a book documenting the negotiations of the first 7 numbered treaties by Alexander Morris, who was a terrible person and did a lot of like, yeah, he's just like one of those like classic, like not like a little bit of a white supremacist, but like totally like advocating it. And moreover, his texts and his lectures founded this sort of like core group of Canadian first white supremacy movements later on. So he really started a lot of that. And so that text is really messed up, but has a lot of interesting stories from his perspective. And flipping that perspective in on itself, I think, was the main goal of this particular text, is what does it mean to like invert that text and think about what's beyond it. And so the sort of lead into that poem is about this idea of paratext, which is this, you know, really academic term for just like the stuff that's part of the text or the book, but is not the book part, you know, the main part. So usually we think of a paratext as something like the cover or like the bio at the back of the book. But what I'm asking is to sort of like include the margins and include everything past that and outside that as part of the paratext. And in that sense, it's not readable because it's infinite and expansive and extremely complicated, because it's all about relationality and the reader's relationship with the world. And so conceptually, it's a really complicated piece for me personally, even if it's very simple. But I think, again, the medium length answer, or the shorter, slightly less short answer, is that the text has this sort of like ghostly cut in the book, and Morris's text leaves that kind of haunting intrusion into this book, like it does into everything, and how that seeps into the pages. I know that's a lot, but I'll stop.
No, that's really great. I love that, Matthew. I think, you know, I think the way your work here re-centers the margin, you know, that the text is not centered. You know, it's the margin that's centered. And, you know, in that opening note that precedes this section, you say that that is through the middle and out the spine, that is the treaty. And I've reflected on that a lot, you know, just thinking about, you know, who is or who isn't included in the treaties, or what non-human things are included or not included in treaties, and what it means to exist within the margin, or and what it means to exist within the text, centered perhaps in a canonical way, through our I guess through Canadian colonialist history. And so I guess I just kind of wondered, what does it mean to not have any other option but to navigate through the margin and to exist in that white space? And then also, is there a metaphorical white space that we're also existing in within that space? I don't know if any of those questions made sense to you.
No, they do. Those are things I think about a lot, because it's sort of forced like upon oneself to a certain extent, right? Like the margins are so big, and it's hard. It's only through the really self-centered lens of the Canadian kind of project that you can view Canada as something that is where the margins are small, or that it's very it's very large. But if you're not viewing through that lens, it's like all margin. Like the margins are huge, and these are spaces that are basically, the survival is incredibly tough for a lot of folks. And like I'm saying these things, and instantly I'm thinking about like RCMP paramilitary like intrusion into sacred spaces in the name of resource extraction projects. And that's what I'm writing about, but in a historical context, and trying to draw this line where, like, look, Coastal GasLink is an extremely straight and straightforward connection to these projects started at the beginning of Canada. Like, these are not, it's not a complicated, convoluted path. Our path is complicated, and the path of the margins is complicated. But the path of that self-centered project of Alexander Morris signing forcing these treaties, British government laws forcing these treaties, that is an incredibly straight line. Like, it's not difficult to trace at all, because Canada wrote it all down, and they put it in a box in the archives and said, this is what we hold to be sacred and true. And that's messed up. Like, it's not so simple as like just the police or just the military. It's that the government said, we want to remember this. We want everyone to remember this forever. And that's just like the scope of that kind of like villainy is just, it's chilling. It really is. So I know that's also a lot to answer a question that might have had nothing to do with what I was just saying, but yeah.
No, that's perfect, Matthew. I really appreciate I really appreciate your thoughts on this. And I think I think that piece, well, I mean, the whole book is a book that I'm going to be thinking about for forever, I think. And I honestly, I can't wait to teach that part. I can't wait to teach the whole book, but I can't wait to teach that part in particular, for the way that, if only for the way that students will react to it, which I think will be like, with perhaps like a bit of like confusion initially. And I think that's what that's what I really love about it. You know, it's a piece that that decenters us as a reader, you know, and I think that that work of decentering is important work, you know, and is work that your book does. And yeah, you know, I think that was a really brilliant answer. I've noticed that Maddie has a question in the chat, which I'll read out. And just before I do, the one last thing I was going to say is I love that I love that that this is the piece that, you know, people ask you about if this is a mistake somehow, that it was printed improperly. I actually get that question all the time, and in Mishka, there's the section right at the very end or close to the end where there's a whole bunch of images, and the images are you know, like increasingly like get distorted and get really fuzzy, and somebody like reached out on Instagram saying they're super angry because they paid $30 for the book, and, you know, the publisher, you know, messed up the printing. And I was like, what are you talking about? And it took some coercing to figure out that was the section they were talking about. And then I had to say, like, oh yeah, that's part of the book. So I feel like that's a thing that you're already used to, and is great. That's wonderful. It's my favorite part of poetry, I think. So Maddie says, hi for such a great reading and for this necessary and urgent project to restory Edmonton through treaty. I'm really curious about the relationships between the poems on script and the forced extermination of the bison, relations that reappear throughout the text. I'd love to hear more about your experiences in the archive, especially around these colonial dematerializations or d/materializations of lost relations /land /ecologies. So if there's anything you want to pick up on there, Matthew,
Thank you for that question. That's like that's the question, right? Like, what is the work of materializing what is lost or taken, when all that we have left is that sort of that box that I'm talking about with, like, here's Canada's like record of things. And I think that, like, my experiences in the archive are really tough to capture. Like, I try my best. Probably some of the best advice I ever got when I started this project was from Christine Stewart, professor at the university here, who was like, just write everything down, like how you're feeling. And it started as this incredibly intellectual project, but it's how it feels and gets recorded in the body that became the sort of the anchor for the whole project. Because the experience of being in the archive and being in those spaces is one that you have to be safe while you do it, because it's incredibly dangerous. Not in like a, you know, careful, don't fall off the cliff kind of dangerous, but in the more emotional kind of danger, traumatic experience danger. And I just remember, like, the thing I want to say when to this question is, I remember walking down the street in Ottawa, past the Parliament buildings, past the Supreme Court, and then you see the main archive building there, and it's just this like edifice of just terror. And if you think about it, and if you think about it in particular ways, it just thunderously brings into focus the violence of the project. And I just remember crying. Like, it was really windy, and, you know, like, wind gets in your eyes and you tear up. But that was not why I was crying walking down the street in Ottawa, just because it's just so incredibly intense and heavy. And I remember being in the archive that day, looking at these boxes of script applications, and just being so sad, and how hard that was. And that was my shortest day of the whole trip in Ottawa, was at the main building, because I couldn't be there for long. It was just too much. And it's still really hard to think about. It's extremely emotional. Like, I have a lot more that I want to write and say about that experience, because there's this like file box that you would find just about any, you could find any file, but in that building, you know, in this box, it's folder after folder of like names of families that I'm related to, and person after person after person of people I am related to. And like people that, like, you know, these are old records, so mostly it's people that I have not met, but there's people my dad has met, there's people my dad knows and talks about. So it's incredibly close. Like, it's not far removed. And, you know, that's a box full of dispossession of land occurring at a time of incredible difficulty that was imposed by the Canadian government, by resource extraction companies like the Hudson's Bay Company. And it was all planned and all considered, and we know all this because it's all written down and signed off by 18 different people and stamped. And the records are incredibly clear. But yeah, so I think that the experience of it is one that you have to be safe, as safe as you can while you do it. There's a lot to your question, so I would love to like chat more about it, because I have a lot more to say about all of those things. But I think the most important one is just my experiences was one that was incredibly difficult, and it's important to be safe and to do that work as well as you can. No, thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maddie, for that question, and thank you, Matthew, for that answer. That's really wonderful. And yeah, you two should totally talk. If I can follow up on that too, you know, just because we're talking about documents and documentation, and you know, I think a big part of this work for me is within the realm of design. You know, and you're very interested in the way documents are put together, and you know, aesthetically how they're arranged and whatnot. I wonder if you can talk a bit about, you know, how those documents influence the book, and like where you picked up on those elements in your creating. I don't even want to say writing, because writing isn't, you know, completely the right word here, but in your creating of this project.
Yeah. I love looking at like old typefaces and old, you know, it's really weird, because there's a part of my brain that's like, oh, I'm holding this document that literally is like the record of dispossession of my family. But at the same time, I'm like, this paper is really nice, you know, like they did a good job. But there's a story there too. And I think that's part of it's not just the materiality of the object, like what the paper is, which again, I could talk a lot about, because there's lots, all of these things are connected to lots of other stories. But the design and the way it's printed, to a certain extent, almost always is one of like expediency and like efficiency and cost. You know, like these documents would look beautiful if they were about something else, and they would look beautiful and be expensive to reproduce. If someone was making like a restaurant menu, something totally different, right? You know, you would have to pay someone a lot of money to come up with something that looked that good. But back in the day when these are made, like in, you know, whether it's the 1870 sort of era of script applications, like the first ones, or some of the later ones, which have a little bit more of the sort of like mechanical or like accounting kind of government form feel to them. And thinking through how the government has changed forms and how those have how those have evolved from, 100 and whatever 50 years ago to now, where you have like online census forms and things like this. The design language of these things is also part of that project. It looks sleek, and it's modern, and it's in colors that work well together, and it's all extremely considered. Like how the government websites are put together is one that is partially at least thought through in terms of design and accessibility and aesthetics. And again, if you pause to think about it, that's really messed up. But you can understand to a certain extent. Of all of the incomprehensible parts of colonialism, the design part, like the visual communications design, is probably the only part that's comprehensible, because those are people who are trying to communicate. And I think maybe that's what gets lost in the rest of it, is the visual communication design folks are trying to tell a story, and they're trying to let people in and be part of the story that's being told. But that's where that stops. Anything after that is just, the content of that is incredibly violent sometimes. So yeah, like I said, I have a lot of thoughts on all of those things. It's a very complicated thing, but those are some like short, maybe not so short answers to that. Hope that helps. I don't know.
Totally. No, I think that's really useful. Like it's, there's, I think going through Whitemud Walking, you can see the trace, of where, perhaps some of those fonts came from, or where some of those, like particular designs, where those points of origin happen to be, and I think that's super interesting, to think about, the design elements of colonialism as, being, some of the most comprehensible. And, that's, yeah, that's gonna stick with me, I think. I have more questions, but also, there are other people here too. So I just wanted to ask if there was anyone that wanted to drop in here with another question. Yeah, I know we joked on Twitter that we wanted this to maybe turn into just a InDesign Q&A / troubleshooting session. And I think I kind of want that still to be the case. But you designed this entire book yourself, or like a bunch of this was your design work, and I think that's a really incredible accomplishment. And I just wanted to ask you if you could maybe speak to how the book came together in that way, or the challenges that you maybe encountered, or the things that maybe weren't that challenging. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot that you don't really think about, I imagine, or a lot, like, not to like, I think once you start getting into the world of designing your own book, or at least the interior kind of like look of something, there's a lot of things that you think about that you didn't really think you had to think about when you got started. And so like that one section with the bleed, right? Like this, like I probably redid this like 4 times or something like that. Because the simple question of like, what size is the book going to be, is actually a really complicated one. And you have it informs a lot of the other things about the book. What is it going to be like when you hold it? What is it going to be like when you are like putting the words on the page and thinking about spacing and all of that stuff? Oh, it sounds like the Oilers might have scored. I don't know. There's some, possibly. So that's a really easy thing to start with, but is actually very difficult. It seems straightforward. How big is the book going to be? But Oh, me and Crystal at Coach must have emailed back and forth like 5 or 6 or 10 times, being like, what size are we going to actually make this? And that's not something I think a lot of my number one piece of advice to writers is that you probably don't want to write in an 8.5 by 11 like standard size sheet of paper, because if you have any like interest in where a line break happens as a poet, that can be radically shifted as soon as you shrink the size of the page. So you might think a line is a certain length, but it ends up not being that length. And so that's like one challenge that's really straightforward. There's obviously lots of other challenges, like how do you make things in InDesign do what you want them to do? Because the software is not straightforward, and it takes, like, literally I've spent like 3 years with this software trying to make sure it looks the way I want it to look. And other more simpler softwares stopped working or being effective for me very, very quickly. And that is a challenge too, right? And there's that's like a huge barrier for a lot of folks, right? Like InDesign is expensive, and you have to keep paying for it every year, which is, that's just the way software subscription services models work now. So yeah, there's like a lot of mechanical things that become challenges that you don't think about when you just want to write a poem about the river.
Yeah, I totally. I feel like I just had a moment where I remembered, the first time that I used InDesign was when I was in my undergrad, and a friend of mine, burned me a copy on a CD, with like a stolen like authentication key or something. And I just used it for free for years and years, and now that's not a possibility anymore, and I feel like that kind of bums me out. It's the barrier to access it is much higher than it used to be. But I wonder, because you're such a visual person, and you work in other visual mediums, you do, you have your own visual art practice, and you work with a whole bunch of different materials, including glass and wood and all that stuff. How did you, was there anything that, I guess maybe the question is, does this book look like what was in your head when you wanted to write it? And was there anything that worked out perfectly, like you got it exactly the way you wanted it to? Was there stuff that that you could imagine but couldn't get to in some way?
Yeah, definitely. I remember making, like, maybe it's like kind of a safety thing, but like I tend to make a lot of models or like small chapbook versions of things, because that's like a simple thing that I can do with my hands to sort of like distract myself from whatever I actually have to be doing next. And so I had moments of like, oh, this will work if I do this a certain way. But definitely, again, it's that bleed line, right? Like this, I remember getting the advanced reader copy for this book and seeing this for the first time was an incredibly emotional experience, because it was one of those things where it's like, it starts out as a vision for something, and then it became real. But then on top of that, that changed how I felt about it. And I think that's like the number one message or like answer to this question, which is that once you have the actual material object that you connect to, that is more generative and more inspiring than any of the like software or screens or even like little paper models of things, right? Like having those things in your hand and seeing them, that is incredibly valuable as a visual artist. And I realized that like there's a lot of, there's like there's obviously like accessibility barriers when it comes to why, you know, designing things in a certain way can be difficult or impossible for folks, some folks to access or experience. And that's why I think just being present and telling these stories is also incredibly valuable, because that's the second part of the answer, which is that as great as the material object is, it's the connection and the conversation that is informed by all these things inform each other. And that's incredibly valuable to me, is that I hold this book and I think, oh, now I can point to this and I can say, this is the story I want to tell, or this is the part of this story that I want to tell and share. And so the material is incredibly important, but that's only one part. And getting the book in your hand is incredibly valuable, but it's not as valuable as like the connection you might build with someone when you're just sitting across from them and talking about whatever. And so being able to facilitate that, I think, is the most important part.
Cool. But that sounds like that's a great moment to end on. I think it was a beautiful answer, Matthew, and we got James back. Hey.
Hi. Jordan. Hi, Matthew. Sorry, that was I didn't want to have to interrupt you guys and give you time.
It's all good.
That was amazing. Matthew, I did want to share a quick story with you about the Wild Margin poem that I don't think I ever did, which was we received a complaint through our distributor from a bookstore on pub day, on your publication day. I didn't want to take the wind out of your sails or anything, so I didn't pass it on. But they were distressed because they had ordered multiple copies of Whitemud Walking, and they found the same printing error in every single one. And of course, you may get a printing error here and there, but they were worried that they'd saw the consistent printing error. And so they said, it's the whole run like this or whatever.
That's fantastic.
Oh my God. That's so beautiful.
I love that.
That's amazing.
I did selfishly want to ask one question, Matthew, before we go, if I could. At the beginning, you brought up that you have one poem you're trying to write. So you brought that up. Your partner pointed that out. I wonder if you could just talk just for briefly about what that poem is, what it was to you. Has it changed over time, and how do you look at it now?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Make it quick, though, please.
Make it quick. Oh, okay. The poem is, yeah, it is a big question, James. I think like it's just the river. You know, like I think the river holds more stories and facilitates more stories than any one person or nation or thing ever could. And if I stand at this river, you know, where literally my ancestors have always lived and in this spot right there, and I look to the left, like there's the mountain, the water goes for all the way to the mountains and the glaciers, and I look to the right and the water goes all the way to the ocean, and that's the whole world in that one spot, and it's all of the past and all of the future. And so the poem is all of that in the sort of just standing and looking at the river. And that's like the simplest answer maybe the quickest answer I could give.
No, that's good. That's beautiful.
That's beautiful. It's a great answer.
Very interesting. Matthew, congratulations. And thank you so much for letting us publish this incredible book. Jordan, thank you for bringing this book, helping to bring this book to light, to Coach House, and for joining us tonight. I know you're not feeling good, so thank you for making the effort. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah.
No one we thought would be a better match to talk with Matthew, so thank you for this. Thank you both. Thank you for everyone who came. This will be up on YouTube tomorrow in case you know anyone who missed it. You can share then. But until then, thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody.
Congratulations, Matthew.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Bye, everyone. Take it easy.
It's always that awkward, like we finished, but we're still in Zoom at a moment.
That's super cool. Yeah, that was awesome, Matthew. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure this book will have an enormous life. Like I said,